So, we're finally here, the final chapter in Catherine's life, having removed her husband from power and brought the Russian Empire back from the brink of collapse. Yet, some of her greatest achievements and some of her darkest moments lie ahead. Welcome to Catherine the Great, Russia's longest ruling female leader, Part 3. So, you all know the drill by now. It's a quick word from our sponsor, me. Patreon, sneak peeks, early access, Amazon, book, and then there's merch. Enjoy. Catherine may have fought off the Turks and defeated the Pugachev rebellion, but her next adversary would be far harder to tackle. This enemy made no demands and claimed no lands. This was smallpox. The disease had destroyed the Austrian line of succession, and there were serious fears that Catherine and Paul may catch the disease. Some were, for obvious reasons, worried that if Paul was to catch the disease, he wouldn't survive to inherit the throne. Catherine herself admitted to living in fear of the disease, as many people she knew had lost their lives to it. It was through this fear that she summoned a British doctor. No, not that one, to inoculate her. The science at the time was incredibly new, and many feared that she'd be killed by the vaccine itself. Although the doctor she hired was an expert in the field, many still felt she was insane. However, Catherine survived and quickly chose to have her children inoculated as well. This was because she believed in setting an example. The plan worked, and most of Catherine's court quickly followed suit. In fact, the plan worked so well, Catherine had inoculation stations set up in most of the Russian provinces. In fact, by the end of her reign, Catherine managed to get 2 million Russian people inoculated. And all without a single mandate. Oh, that's skirting the edge of acceptable YouTube comedy. After the First Russo-Turkish War, Catherine began opening schools for orphaned children. Places like the Moscow orphanage were designed to raise literacy rates and improve the quality of life for these unfortunate youngsters. I mean, they're not young anymore. Kinda. To help further her educational reforms, Catherine set up an educational system for 5 to 15-year-olds. This was then headed up by her educational advisor, Ivan Betskoy. 60,000 pupils would pass through these schools during Catherine's reign, and for obvious reasons, she really believed in women's education as well, so that number is actually made up of both young boys and young girls. However, there was a negative to this, as Catherine didn't believe the peasantry should be educated, as an educated peasantry could become a risk to the government. Government trying to keep its population poorly educated and placated. This could never happen today. On the flip side, Catherine did build hospitals for the poor and reformed the police force from a force for oppression into an actual police force. Catherine also made serious improvements to maps. This is because, allegedly, once in a meeting with a ton of her advisors, they were discussing a small town in a distant territory. Catherine asked for its location, and all of the advisors simply shrugged. The Empress then asked for a map of the region to be purchased, but it was found that those maps were inaccurate anyways, so she just ordered new maps to be made. Now, at this point in her life, Catherine is an idealist, but because of the time period, some things just weren't possible. So this would lead to one of the most controversial moments in her entire reign. Simply put, she planned to make the 8 million serfs living within the empire be considered people. This infuriated her main support base, which was the landlords. This was a contributing factor in her reversing this reform. However, she then doubled down on it by selling state-owned farms to nobles, which then turned their workers into serfs overnight. To make matters worse, she then reversed a proclamation from Peter the Great that prevented the Orthodox Church from owning serfs. But after actually increasing serfdom in the Russian Empire, Catherine did offer a way for serfs to lodge a complaint with their landlord. I'm sure this choice in policy won't lead to anything really bad in the future. This will be fine. Like a lot of political leaders throughout history, Catherine's reforms only really affected urban population centres. Rural Russia, which made up 80% of the Russian population, barely noticed a single change. Well, parts of rural Russia did notice some changes. You see, Catherine encouraged immigration to the areas around the Volga River. Her particular focus was on German farmers as they brought more Western techniques and in turn increased Russia's agricultural output. Yeah, that's what you came to my channel for, to learn about the history of an agricultural output. This then allowed jobs such as carpentry and ironworking to become more viable, and the Volga region became the agricultural centre of Russia. She also encouraged the immigration of scientists to Russia as Catherine preferred science to religion. Catherine was also a patron of Russian arts and literature, her most famous patronage being the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And yes, I messed up museum and not Hermitage. I probably have. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Grigory Orlov, the man who led the charge of placing Catherine on the throne and her one true love, had a problem. That problem was that the man was brutish and rude, and almost all of Catherine's nobles hated him. Eventually he would fail a diplomatic mission and Catherine would have him sent away. However, she didn't do this purely for political reasons. Orlov had grown distant to Catherine and wasn't exactly intellectually stimulating to her. What's more than this, he was also, not exactly faithful. His infidelity was in part because he saw himself as superior to the Empress. My guy bagged the Empress of Russia and thought he could do better. That, my dear viewers, that is called compensating. Catherine moved on and found another lover who she would come to call the most boring man in Russia. In other words, she was dating Teddy from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but instead of discovering that he was boring at a dinner table, he discovered that he was boring alongside all of Russia, and by extension, everyone who's read any accounts from said Russians. So including you now. He was boring. Like this sentence. That is still going. I'm amazed you haven't skipped the video yet. However, the man who gave her his sword knot all those years ago was about to re-enter the Empress's life. Catherine's next love would be Gregory Potemkin. He would be summoned to Catherine's court in 1744, and within the year, he had given her his sword. But this wasn't just a saucy relationship. The two did genuinely love each other, allegedly getting married in a tiny church with 2 witnesses. Catherine also gave him the title Prince Potemkin. We will never truly know if they actually got married. However, Catherine did refer to him as her husband in letters, and she referred to herself as his wife. Catherine bestowed honour after honour on her boyfriend/maybe husband. He was her envoy to Sweden, her representative to the Holy Synod, and the paymaster of the army. He even warned of a palace coup. When Catherine gathered everyone up to discuss laws, he was her guardian of exotic peoples. Don't know if you'd get away with that title in 2022, but Catherine saw that as forward-thinking. Gregory won himself a great deal of renown in the Russo-Turkish War mentioned in the last video. He was well-studied, intellectually curious, and cultured, winning top honours at his university before dropping out. He was also a lover of theology, having contacts not just with Orthodox priests, but rabbis and Cossacks as well. He also connected with the old believers and the ancient tribal religions of the far-reaching corners of the Russian Empire. This is a long quote, but bear with me, because it does really set a picture, and it kind of foreshadows something else we're going to get into. So this quote comes from the Austrian Field Marshal Legini, and when it came to Potemkin, he had this to say. I here behold a commander-in-chief who looks idle and is always busy, who has no other desk than his knees, no other comb than his fingers, constantly reclined in his couch, yet sleeping neither in night nor in daytime. A cannon shot to which he himself is not exposed disturbs him with the idea that it costs the life of some of his soldiers. Trembling for others, brave himself, alarmed at the approach of danger, frolicsome when it surrounds him, dull in the mist of pleasure, certified with everything, easily disgusted, morose, inconstant, a profound philosopher, an able minister, a sublime politician, not revengeful, asking for pardon for a pain he has inflicted, quickly repairing an injustice, thinking he loves God when he fears the devil, waving one hand to the females that please him, and the other making the sign of the cross, receiving numberless presents from his sovereign and distributing them immediately to others, preferring the prodigality of giving to the regularity of paying, easily prejudiced in favour of or against anything, talking divinity to his generals and tactics to his bishops, never reading but pumping everyone with whom he converses, uncommonly affable or extremely savage, the most attractive or most repulsive of manners, concealing under the appearance of harshness the greatest benevolence of heart, like a child wanting to have everything, or, like a great man, knowing how to do without, gnawing his fingers or apples or turnips, scolding or laughing, engaged in wantonness or in prayers, summoning 20 aides de camp and saying nothing to any of them, not caring for cold, though he appears unable to exist without furs, always in his shirt without pants or in rich regimentals, barefoot or in slippers, almost bent double when he is at home, and tall, erect, proud, handsome, noble, majestic when he shows himself to his army, like Agamemnon in the midst of the monarchs of Greece. What, then, is his magic? Genius, natural abilities, an excellent memory, artifice without craft, the art of conquering every heart, much generosity, graciousness, and justice in his rewards, with a consummate knowledge of mankind. Now, I know that was quite a long quote, but that brief mention of Greece, that's important. Now, any young guy suffering from the same condition as me, i.e. having a face only a mother could love, has heard the words, "You can laugh a woman to bed." Well, it turns out it's true, because Potemkin's humour was what Catherine found most attractive about him. In fact, one of his party tricks was that he would impersonate another person right down to their voice. Catherine fell hard for Gregory, and as far as we know, Gregory fell hard for Catherine, but with love this strong comes jealousy. Gregory felt unnerved with Catherine literally having all the power in the relationship. In his eyes, at any given moment, she could remove him from the pedestal she had placed him on. This only got worse whenever Catherine interacted with an ex-lover. These interactions would leave Gregory an emotional wreck, and Catherine would be forced to reassure him that she wouldn't leave him. Catherine could do nothing to alleviate Gregory's anxiety, and eventually his distrust of her began to take its toll on the powerful woman. Catherine eventually spent days in tears, whilst Gregory hid from his problems by plunging himself into his work at the other end of the palace. Hiding from your problems in your work. Can't relate. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, Catherine did eventually drop Gregory as a lover. It is claimed that Catherine found this the hardest decision she ever had to make in her life. Yet, with the relationship over and the pair seeing other people, the bonds restored themselves and they became best friends. They both still loved each other and spent an awful lot of time together. In fact, if any of her new lovers showed any signs of jealousy towards Gregory, she would drop them in an instant. Gregory, meanwhile, would bring Catherine new young men to take on as lovers. It may seem strange to us, but no one could separate the powerful duo. Not even themselves. Now, Catherine was noted as not being particularly beautiful, which I think is a bit rude, but she knew what she was doing and often used her position to seduce young men. Yet, even with all these lovers, other than the alleged marriage with Potemkin, Catherine would never marry again, most likely to keep control of Russia. Speaking of the large quantities of her lovers, it is alleged that Catherine had around 22 lovers in her lifetime, with these men ranging from aristocrats to commoners. Oh, and these lovers were all tested by Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Catherine also enjoyed collecting other things other than lovers. She enjoyed collecting paintings, furniture, and statues that all had unique details on them. As I mentioned earlier, that line about Agamemnon and Greece were important. You see, Catherine and Gregory came up with the Greek plan. This was an idea to restore the Byzantine Empire, an idea that had previously been thought up by Peter the Great. Burkhard Christoph von Munich actually said, "Until the hour of his death, Peter's grand design had always been to conquer Constantinople, to chase the infidel Turks and Tartars out of Europe, and thus re-establish the Greek monarchy." The Russians had claimed that Moscow was the third Rome since the fall of Constantinople, and the connections ran deeper. The title of Tsar, which the Russian rulers had taken right up to the formation of the empire, just meant Kaiser. There was also a decent claim within Russian royalty, as Ivan III had married Princess Sophia of the Byzantine Empire in 1472. To finally reinforce this link, the double-headed eagle was adopted by Russia. Now, obviously, Peter the Great never fully realised this dream, but he did launch the Azov campaign, which gained Russia a tiny port on the Black Sea. And as we saw in part 2, during the 18th century, the Ottomans had begun their decline, ceding chunks of territory to Russia after the Russo-Turkish War. Obviously, this decline then led to Hungary taking chunks of land from them in Eastern Europe. Guess they were peckish. Now, going back in time a little bit, in the 1730s, the Austrians and the Russians had actually fought a war against the Ottomans. There was actually an attempt to retake Constantinople by Marshal Munich, but suffered a defeat, and Austria subsequently withdrew from the war. As mentioned in part 2, the Treaty of that treaty led to the independence of Crimea, an independence that was guaranteed by Russia.
I'm in danger!
The two lovers saw this as a great opportunity, as at the time the other European powers were too busy smashing each other in the face in various other wars. This meant that none of them were able to take any actions against Russia. I swear I've seen this one before. So, the Russian Empire annexed Crimea, and this led to the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, and we'll get there in just a second, but there's a bit more build-up. Gregory Potemkin would rename Crimea and the surrounding area to New Russia, and this was an effort to make the Russian Empire look more like a modern colonial power. Amongst the settlers of these new territories, Greeks were obviously welcomed in, with around 3,000 of them settling in the region over the next century. Another larger group of settlers would actually come from Romania. In 1778, the Russians founded Curzon, which was named after the ancient Greek colony in Crimea known as Korsonius. In 1794, just 2 years after the war, Catherine founded Odessa, which was named after the ancient Greek city of Odessus, which was originally believed to have been settled in Varna, modern-day Bulgaria. Cities such as Tiraspol, Nikopol, Mariupol and Sevastopol all contain the ancient Greek word for city, providing yet a further connection to the Greeks. The plans actually went as far as Catherine selecting a Byzantine empire. Her choice, the Grand Duke Constantine, her grandson. Unsurprisingly, Catherine's grandson was actually named after Constantine the Great and was raised by a Greek maid. They even minted commemorative coins saying "back to Byzantium" on them. This plan got so close to fruition that a British diplomat stated, "Prince Potemkin's mind has constantly taken up with the idea of creating an empire in the East. He has managed to fascinate the Empress with these feelings, and she has christened the newborn Grand Prince Constantine. Gave him a nursemaid, a Greek by the name of Helen, and talked in her own circles about how to place him on the throne of the Eastern Empire. Expanding further into the Caucasus, in 1783, Georgia became a protectorate of the Russian Empire. I'm sure this will have no long-standing consequences. Now, Potemkin set about organising colonies by pacifying local tribes and creating a brand new Black Sea fleet. Now, in 1787, Catherine went on a trip to inspect her territories. On the trip, she met Joseph II of Austria, and the pair formed an alliance to split Ottoman territory between them. Later that year, the Ottomans would demand for their Black Sea territory to be returned, and this was the catalyst for the war to begin. Gregory was now Catherine's supreme commander and delivered a stunning number of victories for the Empress. However, making use of Russia's distraction, Gustav III of Sweden attacked the Russians along the Baltic coast in 1788. In truth, this was only a meagre attempt to alleviate discontent within his own kingdom. The Russian Baltic fleet defeated the Swedes at the Battle of Hogland on the 17th of July, 1788. On the flip side, the Russians themselves were defeated by the Swedes between the 9th and the 10th of July, 1790, at the Battle of Svensgund. After this, the two powers then signed a peace treaty which allowed the Russians to focus all their attention on the Ottomans. The Russian general Alexander Suvorov would lead the invasion, capturing the city of Izmail on the Danube River. The Austrians, however, fared poorly, and this meant that the Russians had a harder time consolidating their gains. To top this off, the other European powers really were not keen to see both Austria and Russia gain so much. It was also a turbulent time on the European stage as revolutions began cropping up in France and Austrian-controlled Belgium. The Prussians then came in and signed a defensive alliance with the Ottomans, which made the Austrians nervous of a two-front war. It's always the Prussians. We could have had Byzantium 2.0, but no. Prussia. Austria would finally pull out of the war when the Austrian emperor died. Leopold II came in and was far more concerned with events in France than he was with reforging the Eastern Empire. Finally, Russia too was forced to abandon the war, a year after Gregory Potemkin fell ill and sadly passed away. On his deathbed, he would dictate one final letter to Catherine. The dream pretty much died with Potemkin, although it did flicker on for a little while longer within Catherine. Yet Russia did nearly capture Constantinople in 1878, with Russian troops marching south to capture Sofia. However, before they could capture the city, they were annoyingly thwarted by the British Navy, which had come to the aid of the Ottomans and forced the Russians to make peace. Sorry, guys. The Turkish Straits crisis and Soviet claims on eastern Turkey would actually force Turkey to join NATO. Touchy subject. But there would be no serious attempts to reform the Byzantine Empire. Yet. In 1792, the Polish pushed for a more French-style liberal constitution. Catherine organised the second partition of Poland alongside Prussia and Austria in response. Later in 1794, Tadeusz Kościuszko would lead a rebellion against the partition. Sadly, Catherine stomped out the rebel force, executing up to 20,000 Poles. Come 1795, Catherine would begin the third partition. This would see Poland and Lithuania occupied until their independence after World War I. This was only temporary, however, as we all know World War II started with Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia marching in and splitting Poland between themselves. This obviously led to the complicated history of communism in both Poland and Lithuania. However, the effects of this would fade away by the 1990s. So finally, after centuries of occupation, the people of both nations were finally free from external powers and ideologies. In 1796, Catherine engaged in what is now known as the Persian expedition after Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar, or Aga Muhammad Shah, invaded Georgia. The expedition was led by Count Valerian Zubov, the brother of her lover, Patton Zubov. He would push the Persians back to Persia, but would find himself out of favour once Catherine's son Paul took the throne. Her son Paul had grown up to mirror Peter. He had been taken away by Elizabeth at a young age to be raised by servants and maids. He was only returned to Catherine after being raised like this for 8 years, and at this time he hoped to recapture some of the warmth he had missed during his youngest years. Catherine did try to be a good mother, but Paul was always jealous of the other men in her life. To the young prince, she focused far more on them than she did him. Catherine didn't help to alleviate this jealousy though, as she grew to see her son as a rival rather than her successor. To be fair to the foreign empress though, her son did technically have a stronger claim to the throne than she did. In her paranoia, she kept him from court and other functions of government. Isolated and bored, Paul began to mimic the man who may not have even been his father, marching soldiers around courtyards. After some time, Catherine and her advisors elected to stop this behaviour as quickly as possible. They did find him a wife, although she sadly died giving birth to his first son, who then also died. As if Paul's luck couldn't get any worse, he then discovered that she had been secretly having an affair with his closest friend. The defeated and grief-stricken prince was eventually convinced to marry again. However, this second marriage was perfect. She eased his anxiety and supported him on their tour around Europe, where Paul, for the first time in his life, found himself being treated as a member of the ruling elite. Many European leaders at the time began writing to each other excitedly, hoping that the boy may follow more in his mother's footsteps than in his alleged father's. Upon his return to Russia, Paul asked for a place on Catherine's cabinet, which she refused. He then asked for some control of the army, but was rebuffed once again. He desperately wanted to help in the affairs of state and take responsibility, but was continually treated like a child. Now, you may have spotted the irony of Catherine's mother focusing on herself and ignoring and belittling a young Sophia. Here we see Catherine eventually making the same mistakes, albeit in a different way. She still prioritised herself over her child. There is also the chance that if he really was Peter's son, perhaps she just saw too much of Peter in him. At the end of the day, these are all still people. Dead people, but they were, they're people. As she aged, Catherine began reversing her once progressive ideals, even disassociating herself from the Nakaz. Towards the end of her life, she dedicated more time to her grandson Alexander, starting rumours that she preferred him for the throne. Catherine passed away on the 17th of November 1796 after having a stroke, allegedly whilst on the toilet the previous day. Another story is that she died after having built a contraption to have relations with a horse. However, this is almost certainly straight out of the mouth of the propaganda machines of other European powers. Her son Paul I succeeded her, and immediately upon his ascension to the throne had all of her papers burned, allegedly because she had disinherited him in favour of her favourite grandson Alexander. To insult his mother, Paul gave Peter III a proper burial and then had Catherine buried alongside him. Obviously being poorly trained and paranoid, come March 1801, Paul was assassinated, being succeeded by Catherine's aforementioned favourite grandson, the Grand Duke Alexander. Alexander would famously go on to lead the Russian people in victory against Napoleon in 1812. Catherine the Great ruled the Russian Empire from 1762 to 1796, a total of 34 years. This makes her the longest reigning female monarch in Russian history. She did put a lot of good into the world, pushing for modern medicine and helping women's education. Yet she was no saint, failing to deliver freedom to the serfs and partitioning Poland. 3 times. Her reforms, whilst progressive in terms of human rights, failed to achieve anything outside of metropolitan areas, and some of her actions still cause pain to this day. So, was she truly deserving of the title Catherine the Great, or was she some awful despot? Or was she a flawed human being given absolute power? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.